Today I'm joined by Dr. Michael Kollo from Evolved.ai. Michael has a background in finance, a doctorate in quantitative and financial methods. Been working in AI, particularly in the finance field, to use the technology for now 15 plus years to solve problems such as expectations, sentiment, and emotion. Really great conversation with Michael to show how the technology should be used to solve or we start to solving the problem. We also wander off into the evolution of the car, if you're interested, as well as conversations about the adoption on Darwinian theories around the evolution of the white collar workforce. I hope you enjoy the listen. Dr. Mike Kollo, and I may have pronounced your surname incorrectly. Is it Kollo or?
It is Kollo, yeah. It's the English version is Kollo. The Hungarian version is Kollo, but I haven't used that for many years now.
So there is a Hungarian background there, obviously, in the name.
Absolutely.
Well, Dr. Mike, welcome to the Dale podcast. Thank you for joining us. It's morning time, me. It's evening time with you in sunny Sydney, I believe, and I'm looking out at a rather dull and dreary Belfast winter morning. You're looking out at the end of a lovely sunset, I hope, in Sydney. Welcome.
Thank you so much. And it is quite picturesque. I wish you could see it.
Well, maybe one day I'll get that site. It's a city. Actually, I haven't been to Australia. The closest I've got is Bali, but one day I will make it down to Sydney and hopefully get to see that sunset. But welcome to the Sindale podcast. Great to have you. You have a wealth of experience. So what we typically cover in this is customer experience, use of technology, and more specifically, the use of generative AI and what organizations are doing. And you know better than me, you have a background in this for a number of years. You have also a background in quantitative economics. Just give me a little bit, paint a picture of that background and how you evolved into the world of AI and I suppose what your company is doing in that space. So before we kick in, we used to get that little bit of background. So your company Evolved.ai, I believe is what it's called. So.
Yeah, look, absolutely. Look, so my background is in financial services. I did my PhD in finance in the London School of Economics and really kind of went on to a career in asset management. I thought I was going to become an academic. I was ready to go and become a professor at the university, and cruel fate intervened, and instead I ended up being in asset management and had the fortune of working for lots of great companies, so BlackRock, Fidelity, and so on. I was always in the quantitative finance area, which is what you pointed out, so more in quantitative research. And my job was to use data and algorithms to forecast markets and outcomes and to put those into investment processes and make them available for our funds. During that course of my career, I was also teaching at university. I taught a bit at Imperial and LSE. And really the first, I suppose, arrival of neural networks, or as a time they were kind of more machine learning and big data, came in around 2014 into the financial world. It's about a good 10 years ago now. And it kind of arrived as a response to the huge amounts of available data that were coming online from places like Twitter or now X and other social media platforms. So you had tremendous amount of flow of what's called unstructured data, which is essentially text data, what people were saying, what they were responding to each other. And I think the financial community was very interested in how do we get insights from this data. And so they were trying to plug it through systems that would kind of give them sentiment analysis, and a field called natural language processing was born. And in initial stages, it was a super simple field where you would create essentially counts of positive versus negative words. And they didn't really have much context or language. And so we started to create these and to understand similarity between two texts based upon similarity of language or positive versus negative language. And I remember distinctly there was even a period of time when if you were a linguist, you were suddenly in demand by hedge funds because all hedge funds were trying to crack the code of how to deal with language. And then, of course, the famous paper came out from Google, All You Need Is Attention. And that kind of changed the paradigm from how do we copy and emulate humans' understanding of language? So all the kind of contextual ways that linguists understand language and translate them, versus a much more mathematical representation or a vector representation, essentially, of what words could be, or what language, and therefore what meaning could be. And I think the success of the translation models initially gave rise to this whole other way of thinking about language as a much more mathematical representation of ideas and sequence of ideas. And really, the initial usage was a much more benign way for Google or others to translate from mostly one European language to another, so French to German and so on. But I think that the kind of revelation for finance was that you could have these invisible patterns within, in this case, language. Obviously, we've been looking for financial markets for a long time, but that it would be kind of beyond your comprehension to follow. So the way that you thought about language is no longer the way that it was being thought about by these machines. They weren't taking your intuition, your ideas, they were kind of creating their own rules. And so that was the 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. And I think in my career, I moved back to Australia for family reasons and really kind of, I suppose, started to see where AI was going, not generative AI. I don't think we kind of understood that. I saw the earlier version of the GPT. They were kind of interesting, but okay.
Yeah.
But I started to see the evolution of AI as a field, as an industry. And I thought this was going to have enormous social consequences, workforce consequences, and so on. And so I stepped outside of financial services and kind of stepped away from my day job of forecasting financial markets and kind of started this whole road about startups and small businesses. I was interested from a personal perspective, how to run a business, how to run small teams. I'd always been a big part of a big machine, or big institutional machines, and here I was by myself. And so I went through a series of really interesting kind of startups and scale ups and learned a lot about technology and how to build technology and scale it and productize it and so on. And I suppose I was in this moment where I was looking at, with a co-founder, we were looking at explainability in AI. We thought this was a huge topic, how to help people understand what AI is doing, how it's doing it. And in the midst of that research and establishing the groundwork, out came ChatGPT. And so ChatGPT was a massive revelation at the end of 22, and suddenly the world became interested in AI. So I did a TEDx talk on AI ethics in 2019. Everybody was listening politely, but I don't think anybody was kind of on the same page. They were a bit like, this guy's a geeky person. I don't know what they're saying or why they're saying it. Whereas I think suddenly in 22, 23, the whole world became enamored with this thing called AI for good and bad reasons. So I set up Evolved.ai shortly after. We called it Evolved Reasoning first, and then we called it Evolved. And really, the purpose of Evolved was, as with a lot of startups, a bit blurry. So what we were trying to do is to help organizations get the best out of these AI tools. And what we found is that there were so many questions and so many misunderstandings that really we were going to be starting with education. We were going to be starting with education for some time. And so I got on the speaker circuit and the masterclass circuit and so on, and just started doing these. And I think I did about 40 last year. I think I'm on track to do 40 this year, if not more. Most of these are financial institutions, asset management, insurance, property, and so on and so on. And really the common question that arises from most of these organizations is what is it? What is AI? What is generative AI? Those kind of questions. And then how does it impact me, my industry, my company? How do I use it? What is the mechanism I should be thinking about? Where is the value proposition? That's a big other question, generative AI. And to a large extent, I suppose, a slightly existentialist question, which is, will I have a job in a world with more intelligent generative AI agents? And in some sense, will I still have a business in that world as well?
Yeah.
And so the questions range really from very practical, how do I put this in here, versus, should I really be panicking or not?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Sorry, excuse me. If we just even step back to your saying 10 plus years ago in the capital markets side of the business, you were really interested in driving AI, and it might be worth explaining a little bit about that, because that's, still very prevalent today. Why is capital markets interested in emotion and sentiment, for example? I know my own little bit of background, a bit about the theory of economics, but it's probably worth trying to, because again, I think it's very applicable to the use cases, and this is probably a very good example why one business or one business sector was using AI and will obviously continue to do so. So what's the applicability there in capital markets, that natural language understanding, sentiment, negative, positive feelings?
Absolutely. So So it has to be said that capital markets, so investment management, hedge funds, and so on, they're in the business of producing signals or forecasting markets. If they get it right, they make millions. If they get it wrong, they lose millions. It's a very competitive game. There's lots and lots of people that play it, so to speak, through companies. And so there's always an appetite to embrace change, innovation, something new. So there's an industry that's naturally curious and is engaged in this highly competitive kind of trading warfare, if you want. And so for many, many years, statisticians, mathematicians, highly technical, as well as behavioral psychologists have entered asset management at some level, trying to provide an edge or a new way of thinking about it or another model and so on. And mixed successes, some good, some bad, but a whole bunch of different things. I think what's really important is that when sentiment analysis came along, there was this wonderful opportunity to understand, I suppose, the behavioral side or the behavioral economic side of what was happening with capital markets. So it's long been understood that people are not rational, that they're not always rational when they're pricing or they're selling or buying securities. And it's also long been understood that when you're trading assets, you're really trading against the belief of the other person holding it or the market's belief. So if the market believes that NVIDIA is going to go up forever, then this is the right price. In fact, this is probably not even the right price yet. And that's fine. So you might look at the price and have a look at the expectations and the feelings of the market from it. And then you might say and compare your own expectations or feeling and say, I'm much more pessimistic, so therefore I should sell. And so therefore, I think lots of investment managers became interested in a specific field of factors or ideas which revolved around the sentiment analysis of participants in the market. So do the brokers that cover the stock, do the people that trade it, do the market participants think of this as a good story or a bad story? Because the same data point wrapped around a different story could be viewed differently. So NVIDIA just made 17% gain in revenues. Oh my gosh, that was below my expectations. I should sell it. And you might have wonderful growth story, but still falling prices. So this recognition that sentiment was a really important anchor came along. And I think this idea of how do we therefore measure sentiment or the information in language and unstructured data so that we can understand what the other market participants are thinking about. That was one very common kind of idea. Secondly, the second one was to actually look at the sentiment analysis of the management. So when you had a CEO or whoever coming out with a statement, their language would be heavily scrutinized for what does it mean, what's the sentiment behind it, and so on. And I would say the third part of this was for a long time, and probably still, is the Federal Reserve. So Federal Reserve was seen as a very important macroeconomic rate-setting entity. And so everybody was trying to work out whether the color tie that Greenspan was wearing meant that he was going to raise rates or not. So everybody's looking for tea leaves in cups. But the most tangible of these tea leaves, I suppose, was the sentiment that was conveyed and the language that was being used and what the language was trying to signal. So all of these kind of fed into these machines, these quantitative forecasting machines that were using sentiment to measure changes in sentiment. So far, the market's been talking about glowing terms about these topics, and now it's starting to actually talk about it in not such a glowing terms. So changes in sentiment were seen to be front-running prices, and so leading indicators of prices. So if the sentiment was going to go down, people were going to get discouraged and sell, or inversely, they were going to buy if sentiment was going up. So there was this kind of a shadow idea behind both fundamentals, so not earnings related or price related, but a sentiment related idea. And whereas a lot of sentiment and prices clearly coincided, so if prices were crashing, everybody was talking poorly, and prices were rising, everybody was following the positive sentiment. There was a sense by which it was really the human sentiment behind these things and narratives behind it that were going to be pushing prices around. So therefore, natural language processing became a really important part to understand not only the fundamentals, but the sentiment behind those fundamentals.
Yeah. And the reason I wanted to unpack that a little bit, because if we roll forward 10 years, the advent of Gen AI and what you've just described there is a real problem that, it's driven by economic theory and the theory of expectations and what capital markets need. But that has been there for a long time, right back from the foundation of economic theory. So industries and organizations have always been looking to solve that problem, sentiment, understanding, expectations. AI is a very natural technology to fit into that. But if we roll forward now to the world of Gen AI, I think, and I'm interested to get your opinion, it has almost kind of flipped into a technology in some industries looking for a problem to solve. So your CIO is going, Gen AI, we must use it without actually understanding what is the fundamental problem. So I think that's why I thought the analogy of the capital markets and economics, it clearly always had this problem to try and solve. It just so happens the advent of AI and probably particularly now Gen AI is a really good way of helping solve that problem, but they've always had the problem solved. So I'm interested to understand or get your thinking on that flip that CIOs, particularly in organizations, and I know you did the fictional CIO story, are jumping into technology and then trying to reverse engineer, well, what can we use this to solve? What's your thoughts around that?
So I think that's a really good observation. So I think the reason that asset management is a hyper example is because it's trying to solve a nearly impossible problem. So a great signal for most, practitioners, and this is less known, I think, in the public, but is let's say 52% right, whereas a random dart throw is 50%. And so the margins of success are tiny, but the gains are potentially great. And so therefore, there's incentive to throw experimentary technology at the problem and give it a shot, because otherwise you just kind of seed back to the randomness. For a lot of other organizations, their baseline is to keep going and doing what they're doing today. And if I turn that into equivalent language, they have an 80 or 85% success rate or efficiency rate at that, just as an arbitrary number. And so therefore, they've got a process, they've got a set of people, and they sell insurance, or they sell technical advice, or they make shoes, or whatever else they do. And something like AI emerges and says, okay, here I am. This is a new system that has mastered language. It has a linguistic IQ of 120 or 30 or whatever it is, and is able to augment, or in some case automate, the kind of flow of language information across an organization. So pretty abstract capability that it turns up with. It's not a applied, when it's more like saying, I can, I don't know, speed up the electricity flow slightly or something, or in the case of, let's say, if I'm building a house, I've got a slightly, not slightly, but let's say meaningfully different material to build houses out of that makes walls able to warp into different shapes. So no longer will you be squared rooms, now you can warp it. For most people, they will look at that and go, I don't know what to do with it. I kind of understand it's more efficient, but it's really weird for me to be in a warped room. I need it to be square or whatever. So there's a whole bunch of human behavioral elements. And then there's also not necessarily an impetus to innovate. And so what I've seen here is a lot of industries, even if you showed up with an amazing language model capability, they literally all they had to do is take off the shelf and put it into their business. They didn't have to create a model. They didn't have to get the data in order. They didn't have to organize all this themselves and whatever else. All they had to do was to take it off and plug it in. They still struggled from a top-down perspective with that idea. And it kind of really made me think about how, I suppose, we in finance, at least, take for granted that we understand the problem we're trying to solve, make money, beat the markets. And therefore, anything we can throw at that can just be rapid experimentation. Whereas for lots of other industries and companies, they're not entirely sure what is the problem they're trying to solve. They're not entirely sure where the gains could be. And they're not entirely sure what is the economic value of solving each one of those things. Unless it's like a dead obvious automation problem. Like, I don't want to pay those two salaries. Can we get rid of those people? And so unfortunately, I think as a result, these conversations are not very straightforward. You spend a lot of time talking about what the technology could do for them, what it is capable of doing today. Then you spend even more time talking about, well, how is it that they do things today? Are they systematic in the way that they do things? And actually, ironically, AI shines a massive light on human competence and human processes when it arrives in an organization, more than it shines a light necessarily on the AI itself.
Yeah, and I think, quite recently I was with they're a global car manufacturer, and they are interested in AI, and it's the same probably conversations you've had multiple times. So our typical approach would be, well, what are your uses? What are you hoping to solve? What's your value proposition that you want to do with it? So provide us some use cases. We mock that up, what that would look like. Some of the feedback was really, that's really good, but we were hoping to see something really innovative. And my answer was, well, we can show you stuff really innovative, but what are you going to do with it? What is your problem? And I don't know, do you face that still? And I know you do the education piece. I assume you do. And how do you overcome those barriers? Or I suppose more importantly, not from the vendor side, from the organizational side, how do you help them, overcome that problem? It's just not technology. It is something to solve.
I think that's a really good and really tricky question, which basically says, in some sense, maybe I'll step back from this. Technology itself, I think, has a certain shape that we expect to see. So for most organizations, I think it comes in one of two shapes. One is incremental product improvements, products that work, that sit on your desktop, that handle your email, that handle your payroll, that handle your HR records. There is no probability, there's no intelligence, there's no prediction, there's no thought processes. They seem to be the toothbrush products. And that's how SaaS is priced. That's how the whole technology does. So everything that they've received so far in a technology channel that they pay for on a monthly subscription is incremental in value and is always kind of does what it does. Now, lots of people are unhappy with all the features and they don't get to do, and so it's not a perfect fit, but it's a very sort of a blunt tool if you want to do these things in a repetitive and scalable way. And then the other way the technology enters the company is through pixie dust, where there's this kind of fairy dust that arrives and people are like, whoa, look, robots walking around or self-driving cars or whatever. And in some ways they induce a mix of wow and fear. And so a lot of the future of work narrative is based around you have to retrain, otherwise you're not going to have a job and so on. So it's a bit of a U-shaped problem whereby it's either incremental and the IT department will do it and it's just whatever, or it's like wildly imaginative and futurist without necessarily path to achieving that or getting to that. And so for some boards and organizations, walking that line is really tricky because you have to get their attention by talking about the bigger changes that could happen to the industry and to the business. But then you have to lead them back to the incremental path and go, well, actually, in order for us to walk through that, we're going to have to take these bunch of steps. And most of those steps are actually not necessarily about technology, but about culture of that organization. So how the organization is actually able to make these changes or not. And I think the second observation I would have about that, just about the human part, is AI, this kind of AI, generative AI, is truly, truly confusing for some people. Like it's a really different manifestation of technology than we've ever seen in our human existence. Like we have so far understood mathematics to be synonymous with spreadsheets, to be synonymous with algorithms and data. And it's all bucketed in the same category. And if you think about the future of narrative, it says that it's all about STEM and it's all about that world. And so there's a sense by which the data people team will be in the basement doing the algorithms and making stuff run in the background while we humans
rummaging through buckets of binary numbers.
Exactly, yes. Exactly. And kind of making Star Trek jokes to each other or whatever. And essentially just kind of doing the background operational scale data stuff, which we know is kind of necessary, but it's in the background. But I, as a human, because I'm great and I'm fascinating, I'm a leader and I'm a person with domain expertise, I'm going to be guiding the organization and connecting people and creating culture and brand and awareness and leading and so on. And there's so much culture and language and education around that part. And these two educational sources are almost completely untouched. So if you're learning about data science, you're not learning about leadership. If you're learning about leadership, you certainly are rarely talking about data. And now you've got this technology that bridges the two almost simultaneously and says, this is a language-based AI that is able to speak language, articulate ideas, increasingly with emotion, with context, with clarity, with professionalism, with domain knowledge, with search. It digs into the very way that you think about things and cognitive frameworks and reasoning paths and all these kinds of things. And in some case, does better than you could by reasoning through problems and by then communicating them as well. And that's in the forest of human leadership and human organization stuff, it's a brand new animal.
Mm.
And it looks like them, but it sees nothing like them. So there is no framework for them to accept this. On the other side, you've got the programmers who are like seeing the language model coming into their organization going, yeah, this is great. It's a tool that allows me to write coding language even faster,
Yeah.
and roll out production code and review for me. So it's very rapid iteration and development of language models as coding or co-piloting coding tools, which is just giving to rise to very rapid adoption. And I think the software development area of the world will change, extremely fast because of that level of adoption. Whereas on the other side, it feels like it's a really unbalanced thing, where the other side is like, I don't know what to do with it. One of the epitomes of this industry group, and I'm going to pick on one just to be prescriptive, is HR. So
Mm.
human resources are faced with a lot of tasks that involve language, reading CVs, articulating
Mm.
job roles, interviewing for them, providing feedback, aggregating feedback, looking at legal contracts, hiring, firing, 100% language-based, transcript-based kind of work. AI is phenomenal at that. Like there's a whole bunch of things that generative AI does beautifully that would give 80, 90% rise in improvement. In all of the conferences I've done to a room full of HR professionals online and in person, I have seen very little impetus for that group to put their hand up and go, I can't wait to use this technology to make myself more efficient.
And why is that? Is that a fear factor, or do you have any idea on that?
I mean, if anybody who's sort of HR background, listen to this stuff, or maybe just close your ears now because you may not like it.
We will apologize in advance. Yes, we're not
Exactly.
slighting
I'll
any
apologize
slighting
now.
any career or industry.
So look, my thinking is that look, and the reason I picked on HR just for a second, by the way, before I go into the answer to that question, is because HR is, I think, at least in idealistic terms, the custodian of human capital within an
Mm.
organization. That's the counter to AI. So AI and human capital make outcomes in some sense. In the classical capital sense, it would be capital and human capital, human resource. And now it's going to be AI and human resource with the arrival of agents. So you'd expect the AI, so the human resource department to be the custodian of human capital, the value, the training, the betterment, and so on and so on. And I suppose what I observed is that for most organizations that I've come across, HR has devolved in function from one of idealistically a strategic workforce planning and capital kind of management resource to an administrative resource,
Mm. Mm.
whereby the administrative resource provides assistance to the business units on essentially hiring practices, but very high level assistance, and is a kind of a center of excellence for things like contracting or legal problems. So you really only call in the HR department when you're trying to hire, fire, or follow some kind of rules
Yeah.
or regulations. But you're not calling them in to help you to make better decisions, to think about what kind of resources you might need, how many you might need. Well, businesses make those decisions about who they want to hire, how much they want to hire, and then they get the HR to essentially do the end bit. And the reason, and therefore, I think what you end up at is an industry that is devolved of power or responsibility or that kind of business proactivity, although they are in name featured in boards, outcomes and in people and culture conversations and all those wonderful things. I think they have probably a shadow of the actual power that they probably could or should have based upon those
Mm.
roles. So I think I don't know. I sort of get the sense that I think and this is where you going back to the AI point. I think this is where you get to this observation that even though this capability is phenomenal and interesting and has language components and whatever, not all parts of the organization are ready and primed or thinking very hard about self-improvement, efficiency improvement, or innovation. Most of them are thinking about execution and straight
Mm.
execution, and so far they've been fed technologies that are directly playing into their execution processes in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, we could stray off into the HR debate, and because human capital is usually a significant proportion of any organization's assets. In my view, HR could be a pervasive function throughout that, how you manage people, who you want, as opposed to this, devolved, let's hand it off to HR. to do the review, to do the recruitment, to do the firing, to do whatever you have to do. And I suppose that does lead into the adoption of technology and why it stops in certain areas of parts of the business. If we drop back into like the end of 2022, the hype, and there was 6 months of hype, and everybody was kind of, no matter what age, what they were talking about was AI, not necessarily Gen I, but AI. Everybody knew, everybody was an expert. And there was a lot of education going on. There was a lot of what we do. Where do you think we are now? And we're in late 2024, so we're 2 years into the cycle. Whether it's a hype cycle is another question or not, but we're 2 years into the cycle. Where do you think we are in that adoption? Are we still educating? Are we like proof of concepts? Are we moving anything into production? Are we seeing real value? There are some use cases I see out there, but don't seem massive. So I'm interested in your take on that.
So I think it's a great question. And there's an ongoing strong debate I see online, hype versus non-hype. And these two camps, as usual with social media, there's no middle ground. There's only one end throwing abuse at the other end. But I suppose in the more considered conversations, I would say, okay, so this is my take on it, and you can kind of shoot me for it later if you like. But early on in 20th century, we saw this thing called a car, and it was this really flimsy, weird thing with wheels and an engine that would break down and refined petrol that you needed for it, and all this kind of stuff that was really hard to do and get going, and it would get stuck in mud all the time. And you looked at a horse and went, these are so much better, right? And today, you can't point to me, or you can point to me very few houses or residences in towns and cities that are not within a couple of meters of a specially designed architecture and infrastructure that has been there specifically put there for the cars, called a road. And it's like pervasive in all of our cities, in all of our towns. There is bitumen and there's concrete or whatever for these damn things called cars to go around. And we have petrol stations littered everywhere. We have traffic lights everywhere. And there's a certain amount of people that die every year from the use of these technologies directly. And yet, this is what we have today. And it's 80 or 100 years later, let's call it. It's more than 100 years later. And so I think when you start to think about that and you go, okay, we have a smaller example of digital space, but it's very pervasive. It moves very fast. So we had the internet as well in the 1990s. It wasn't clear who was going to win, but it was clear the world was going to change. Sure enough, 20 years later, we're all kind of nodding away, going, of course, we have emails and internet and e-commerce. And I saw a funny statistic recently about how people used to meet and date. And there's this kind of graph from the 1930s of family, friends, introductions, co-workers, whatever. And the graph is kind of unchanging, a little bit of more co-working in the 80s or 90s and those kinds of things. And suddenly online dating enters and then just goes up and just dominates. And it's like 65% now. And so there is this kind of non-linear effect that when a technology becomes pervasive, it dominates. So the VCs and Ps are really betting that that's the case here. If I look at language models and what they're capable of doing, and if I think about what we're doing right now, which is we're exchanging information through the medium of language, and we're not in person, we're kind of a distance. And I think about this in an organization, and I think about this within social environments and so on. And I think of this as the connective tissue, the membrane that keeps a society together. Sapiens are a great example of the book of that highlights this. And I think, language is extremely pervasive across all fields of commerce and activity. And to have a model that can intermediate and step in between every single language interaction could be extremely pervasive. And so I, for a moment, have not thought this was hype. I think this is absolutely real. Now, having said that, I think the thing that lags, so on the one hand, you've got the capitalist and the capital for creating the data centers, the energy infrastructure. And for the many business leaders who get to go off on road trips in the West Coast of the US, they're shown these plans and what's coming, and they're all in amazement. They all come back going, wow, the world is going to be different. And they usually call me and go, Mike, can we talk? Because that thing you said about AI last time I heard you was great. But now that I know what's coming, I just think like there's a tsunami coming of change. And so there's a sense by which they understand what their future looks like, and it's very, very different. The everyday organizational person, in this whole, let's call it media cycle that took AI in 22 and 23, put us very much on a defensive foot. It immediately portrayed AI as a competitive, combative technology that was going to take our jobs and whatever else. As a result, the safety, ethics, warning bells, issues, potential issues, imagined issues, all got to the top of the table of
Yeah.
boards, directors, executives, and so on. And there was a real sense that organizations straight away went, "We're scared, shut it down. Shut it down. We don't want any secrets going out everywhere. This is terrible, whatever. This is Bitcoin all over again, or whatever." And I suppose at that moment we took a hard step back. You remember there was all these articles in 23 about existentialism. Oh, this was going to kill us.
Yeah.
There was a
Yeah.
bunch of research. We wrote a common paper saying we need to pause this. We're not ready. We're not ready. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's all wrong, but I'm saying that was our instinctive public reaction.
Yeah.
There was no narratives in the news around a future where AI was good to us. There was only a future where AI minoritized us, divided us, took our jobs, this and et cetera, et cetera. So I felt like where we are now is in the background, organizations have kind of come to this realization that the future is AI. There are certain industries that are at the front of this language wave, if you want. So education, teaching, PR, any kind of service-based industry that involves writing reports, research, language, whatever. And then there's a whole bunch of others that are seeing incremental 20, 30% improvements, but depending on what they're doing. But that could be anything. Trucking companies using AIs to review footage and video and so on, lots of different applications. I think what I'm seeing in terms of the use cases is that a lot of organizations are playing around the edges, and there's a death by use case problem that's been going on for about a year now. But that's partly because the problem of AI has been defined as a technology problem. And so it's handed
Yeah.
over to the CIO, CTO to solve. And the CIO, CTO kind of pushed it down the line into the ecosystem of younger people in the organization to do something with it. So they're playing around, testing new things, having a go, and seeing whether they can get like a Hello Kitty to pop up quicker or whatever else.
Yeah.
And it is not meaningful kind of bigger rewirings of an organization. They're kind of incremental, what am I doing now kind of problems. And so that's the way that we're using this technology is not great. Having said that, I think what's coming at us are kind of Amazon moments, probably a string of them, whereby a competitor comes in with such a different business model, such a rapidly better solution at a lower price point that we'll just have a Darwinian events where entire organizations just won't be able to kind of adopt and move up incrementally as they had hoped they were going to do through experimentation, but they'll just be rapidly competed out, or will have to rapidly reach for this technology to become on par or competitive with their others. And don't forget, to this very day, you can walk around the US and find, for example, companies, I'm picking the US, UK as well, companies that are really behind. They barely know how to use a spreadsheet. They do things at the back of a napkin, and they still exist. So it's not the
Yeah.
case that just because you have superior technology, everybody else will bow down to you for all industries in all kind of ways. And so I think it's really important to understand that. The second part to understand is that no matter what the industries do and companies do on a gradual level, the take-up amongst individuals is phenomenal. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
it is very high. And small businesses, people who are used to juggling different things and doing different things, are using it. Students are using it. The next generation is using it. If we do nothing else but wind the clock forward 20 years, 80%, 90% will expect to see ChatGPT on a desktop
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they grew up using it. And
Yeah.
therefore, I feel like absolute adoption is upon us in that
Yeah.
time frame, which, as if you're an investor, you're wondering whether you should buy NVIDIA now. Your time frame is 6 months. That doesn't tell you about what happens in 6 months.
Yeah.
But
No,
if you're,
sorry,
sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, and the only thing I was going to add, but if you think about building nuclear power plants or not to support the energy consumption of all these models, then yeah, 10, 20 years by size span is probably even too short for you. You're probably like scrambling around now and trying to figure out how you're going to do that.
No, I agree. And if you look at technology adoption, the iPhone was another great example. I think this is led or will be led as much by the consumer as it will be by industry. And that demand and the expectation, back to where we started in economic theory, the expectation of consumers that they can use the technology, they can use it to make their individual life better. And if you, as a service provider, as an organization, are not giving them, it doesn't have to be overt, but it certainly has to be part of the service that they're delivering. And I think, again, I know we're probably coming up on time here, but I see it as almost part of the Darwinian theory of evolution. I don't mean natural selection and that AI is going to take over, but the ability of society and humans to adopt to their environment, that aspect of the theory. And I don't know what if you have a thought on that, but I think that's how we will evolve in more that Darwinian approach.
Yeah, and I think, look, as somebody who uses the technology frequently, all the time, in fact, I would say that, and is quite self-aware of my own cognitive limitations and capabilities. I think I'm certainly seeing a shift in my skill set and my approach to problems. Like I'm absolutely growing lazier, like I would be with a spreadsheet and maths to do things. I
I'm
absolutely
laughing. I'm laughing. Yes, I am the same.
and that's I now I'm good at reading summaries, and now I'm good at directing how I want the summary to look, or how the high level information comes in. So more like I've stepped in from a builder of a document, like a laborer moving bricks around and mortar, to being a foreman or an architect even, and kind of being above the build side and having AI kind of fill in the blanks for me. And every now and then still stepping in and putting a couple of bricks right, but mostly just sitting at that planning level. And I mean, again, I think the thing that I have to be very aware of is that not everybody can go to that understanding. So back in I want to say 12, but I could be wrong here. Intelligence Squared, wonderful organization in the UK, did a wonderful debate saying robots are going to take my job. And it was, back in there, everybody was afraid, obviously. And there was 3 against 3. And ultimately, there was a bit of wishy-washiness and hand-wavy. But the most compelling argument, I think, was said by the positive side, which basically said, look, in the Industrial Revolution, you had machines taking physical labor from people because they were clearly stronger and more able to endure that kind of physical requirements. However, with the intellectual kind of revolution, I suppose, that the AI offers to bring, the question will be what happens when a system is able to do things at an IQ level of 100 or 110? How many people can you shift up the curve to the right-hand side here? Because with physical labor being automated and agriculture being automated, you basically move people into white-collar offices where they were still suitable to work. And now you're going to be moving them out of white-collar offices because you're actually going to be automating those stuff in digital world as well. And it's not clear where the next station is after that. And so I think that stuck with me, even though it's like 10 years perhaps too early, as a kind of a useful analogy to think about the fact that the workforce shape itself is an outcome of the economic demand supply equation and all the firms and competition and capitalism and so on. But nobody actively manages that workforce shape. And I've had this experience firsthand from the UK government, from Australian government, from others. It's kind of assumed to be an outcome of what happens in the general hustle and bustle of a market economy. And we haven't so far been in our generation or the previous one in a position where we've had to proactively manage the shape of that workforce because of some external event that's happened, like a big world war or something like that, where a lot of that workforce gets depleted or moved away, or in this case, potentially automated.
Yeah, I think it's a very good analogy, that white collar versus blue collar, and you're right, blue collar, industrial revolution, automation. I think white collar, I suppose in theory, more higher paid jobs. Now those individuals need to think. And I laughed at your analogy about the spreadsheets, because I do it all. I used to pride myself on how good my spreadsheets were and how good my formulas and macros were. And I could write a macro spreadsheet to do anything. And just yesterday, actually, I was sitting with one of my colleagues and we were trying to work out a formula. And of course, the default was I'll stick that in the chat GPT and it'll tell me very quickly what the formula should be. And then I thought, am I getting dumb doing this? But the realization to me was again back, okay, my job in that white collar sense is changing. So I'm not there, you say, I'm not there to lay or build some of the bricks. Now I'm there to actually, can I now use my time, to be more, to be better, to drive more performance in what I personally do and therefore de facto. So I think that change of psyche is probably the biggest thing that's going to happen within the workforce, within that white collar workforce, is kind of a reevaluation of what is my value here. And we all have value, but it's just, can we figure out where it fits? And can I accept that it's changed from what it was yesterday or last year? And then can I actually then leverage the technology to try and enhance my value to the organization as opposed to worrying about, will I have a value in the organization?
And I think that that's an interesting one is that I think all that this whole AI story tells us is that there's change. It doesn't say that we're heading to a fiery cataclysm or anything like that. It just tells us that that change is coming and that certain kinds of skills and capabilities will become less valued by the current economy. So not valuable, but in itself, but valued in terms of the economic value that we assign to them. Just the same way that teachers or typesetters or writers are very valuable in terms of what they do. Just the salary situation is what it is. So I think in the same kind of way that we'll have a rebalancing of how that works. What we're not very clear on at the moment, and I think lots of organizations are trying to work out, is what is the new future of work look like in the scenario like this? Because the old future of work was STEM, programming, coding, statistics. Now you have a system that pretty much does a basic level of coding. And just as a quick diversion, I used to be a big VBA programmer, and it's a lot more powerful and cool than what people realize, but it is a bit, fidgety in some ways. So recently I wanted to do a bit of automation and I went into Google Sheets rather than Excel, never written code in Google Sheets. So it's a different kind of language, but comparable in many ways. And using Claude in my case, I literally wrote what I would assume would have taken me 3 weeks of fiddling around with syntax and banging my head against and how did I get that wrong and so on, to something that was working beautifully. And every time it didn't, I fed it back in and it just rewrote it. What I started noticing is I didn't really care about the process it went through, the iterative process of getting it right. But I looked at the final code and I went, yeah, that about makes sense. And I kind of squinted at the code and the syntax and said, yeah, I kind of understand what you're doing. But that was it. And so I don't know what classification of the future of work that is, where you're squinting at things and going, it's about right. And kind of the architecting, but it's not the same as it was even a couple of years ago. And I'm not sure that all the universities and training organizations and training courses and people that have been set up so steadfast in a STEM future over the last decade, I would say, if not more, are able to kind of pivot into that new world. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're so true on that, but I'm conscious of our time. We could chat all day or all evening in your case, and I think we're going to have to revisit this and pick it up maybe in 6 months because it's a brilliant conversation. But we are up against, and I've used up a lot of your time, Michael, this afternoon, this evening. It's been a real privilege. Thank you for joining today, and I know the audience and the listeners will have a real insight into some of the discussions around the use of AI, the quantitative use of AI, and where it's going. Thank you very much.
Thank you.